I've worked now at Ogilvy for practically 30 years, mostly as a copywriter, and I've done pretty much an equal mix of B2B and consumer marketing. And there's one really big difference between them, which is that essentially, in consumer marketing, consumers don't act like rational consumers are supposed to act, and in B2B marketing, business people don't act as rational business people are supposed to act. The closer I get to behavioral science and understanding what you might call behavioral economics and some of the depths of human psychology, I realize there's only one discipline. There's essentially marketing. And it's based on human insight into what people really want, as distinct from what they say they want. Now, there is one respect in which B2B marketing is more difficult than consumer marketing. And it's not the complexity of the target audience, it's nothing like that, it's actually your colleagues. Your pain-in-the-ass non-marketing colleagues are worse in a B2B environment than they are in a consumer environment. Why is that? Because in a B2B business, the pretense of buyer rationality is much, much harder to shake off than it is if you're in a consumer goods company, for example. And so the extent to which your colleagues will behave and will never, ever be blamed for behaving as though all purchase decisions were completely driven by an economist's idea of rationality is even more powerful in your sector than anywhere else. And I've called this on innovation. Innovation isn't a spelling mistake. I genuinely believe it's a thing. And what it is, it's the obverse of the particular innovation coin, which is there are two ways of creating economic value. You can either work out what people want and find a really clever way to make it, or you can work out what you make and find a really clever way of making people want it. And there is no worthwhile economic distinction to be made between those forms of value creation. As I said, the difficult bit in B2B is that everybody pretends that everything is rational and every decision is objective. And so the position you find yourself in is that classic case of being the only person who thinks different in the room. Now, a lot of comedy actually revolves around this.
Turn on the searchlights now.
If we can just play this with slightly louder volume once more. This is from the film Airplane.
Expecting us to.
Once more.
Maybe we ought to turn on the searchlights now.
Oh. That's just what they'll be expecting us to do.
What you have, that is actually a more interesting clip. It's not only funny, it's actually very, very revealing. What you have to be a good marketer is to have an absolutely overriding fear of the obvious. What nearly everybody else in your business has is an overriding love of the obvious. Because you never get fired for being obvious. It's much, much easier to be fired for being irrational than it is for being unimaginative. The problem I have is that in 30 years of experience, practically every time I get to test something that doesn't make conventional sense, it works. And an explanation for this, by the way, is actually found in evolutionary psychology. That the human brain evolved a sense of reason not to make decisions. We didn't evolve the whole prefrontal cortex mechanism and our capacity for reasoning and rationalization to make decisions. We evolved it as a social species to defend our decisions and to argue our case. So the brain we have isn't the brain of Stephen Hawking, it's the brain of George Carman. We've evolved the sense of reason of a lawyer, of a defense lawyer, not the sense of reason of a scientist. And it's a really, really important facet to understand. Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber, two French psychologists, have written a book called The Enigma of Reason, which is precisely about this. I think it's one of the most important breakthroughs in psychology in the last 50 years. That actually, we assume we have this power of reason. We're not really a rational animal, we're a rationalizing animal. We decide things instinctively, and then we drag an off-the-shelf post-rationalized justification, and then we delude ourselves that that was the initial reason for our action. Genuinely, our behavior doesn't work like this. So the most important thing you can do is fight. What you have is, in that case, by the way, it's very interesting, If you think about it, military strategy is like marketing. You can't be obvious. Very interesting, very, very important point. There are large fields of human activity where being rational is fatal. Because if you're a rational military strategist, your enemy will be able to predict exactly what you're going to do, and they'll lie in wait, and they'll kill you. The whole point of military strategy, very similar to marketing, is the judicious and imaginative deployment of deliberate inefficiency. If you think about it, if you'd allowed the procurement department to plan the D-Day landings, they would have insisted that you made the journey between Dover and Calais to minimize fuel costs. The problem with that approach is that's exactly where everybody was expecting you to do it. If you actually pursue logic in marketing, of course, you often end up in the same place as all your logical competitors, which is an overcrowded space. So the vital thing you have to do in a marketing culture is create permission for people, at the very least, to test counterintuitive things. If the only things you test are the things that are logical, you'll find quite interesting things. If you test illogical things, sometimes you'll fail, but sometimes you'll practice a kind of alchemy. One of the weirdest bits of recommendation I ever made was to a fast food company in South Africa who had a product that wasn't selling. I said, try putting the price up. Now, economists get really, really angry when I tell this story because they claim it's impossible. Sales went up when the price went up. Now, anybody who goes to fast food restaurants occasionally will know that actually there are two completely opposite reasons you go to a fast food restaurant. One of them is for a bargain, and the other one is for a treat. If you price something halfway between the two so it isn't a bargain or a treat, you've actually created no emotional value at all. You know, there's TK Maxx and there's Bond Street. And the same people go to both, but it's just a different context. And so I always describe marketing very simply as the science of knowing what economists are wrong about. And there's a really, really important reason why this has to be so. I don't know how many people here have studied economics or read about it a little bit. All economic models basically assume that the person making a purchase decision is doing so in an environment of perfect knowledge and perfect trust. Now, in an environment of perfect knowledge and perfect trust, marketing wouldn't need to exist. Everybody knew exactly what they wanted, how much they were willing to pay for it, and they'd go and buy the thing that maximized their utility. Three things, actually. One, that means that anybody who studied economics at business school instinctively hates marketing because they see it as a necessary evil, not as a source of value creation. Second thing, those conditions they assume never exist in the real world, or somewhere between very rarely and never. Third thing, even if we could create those conditions, our brains have not evolved to make decisions under such conditions. We are not optimized to make decisions with perfect information. We're optimized to make non-perfect but pretty good, non-catastrophic decisions based on imperfect information in an environment of imperfect trust. And that's what we do. And we make the decision instinctively, and then we post-rationalize. Has anybody ever had to do appoint an agency where you have that, that stupid form where you have to balance scorecards? Has anybody done that? Okay, can you all admit the same thing? That you decide which agency you want to win, and then you backfill the fucking numbers, right? Okay? Because everybody does that, because the other way of doing it is a totally unnatural way for the human brain to make decisions. We don't make decisions by adding up a variety of different attributes and actually looking at the maximum. We probably ask ourselves a different question. We go, can I imagine myself in 4 years' time working with these people, continuing to produce great work and still liking them? And then we answer that question, and we choose the agency, and then procurement forces us to fill in those stupid little numbers just for the purposes of pretending the decision was made rationally. Now, this is a really important thing. This applies to B2B marketing, it applies to consumer marketing. In terms of the science of knowing what economists are wrong about, here are 5 things humans care about massively, but which economists don't understand at all. Okay? Status, now actually, interestingly, that's probably even bigger in much B2B marketing, questions of status, than in B2C. Certainty. No one ever got fired for buying IBM is probably the greatest B2B end line ever written. So certainty is something we really care about. Low variance. In other words, I'm not sure this is the best decision, but it's the decision that's least likely to be terrible. I argue, interestingly, that I think most brands appeal actually to our love of certainty. We actually pay a premium for brands not because we necessarily think they're better, but because they're less likely to be bad. In the same way that McDonald's is the most successful restaurant in the world, not because it's brilliant, but because it's really, really good at not being crap. Okay? Say what you like about the Golden Arches, you're never significantly disappointed, you're never ripped off, and you never get the shits. Okay? Something you can't say about any Michelin-starred restaurant, to be absolutely honest. Okay? Autonomy, this partly explains Brexit, which is why economists are particularly baffled by a Brexit vote. But we like optionality. We don't like getting tied in. The mobile phone market discovered this when it finally had to introduce pay-as-you-go. Okay? Relatedness, we make a distinction between dealing with the same person 3 times and dealing with 3 different people once. As human beings, we naturally seek connectedness and reciprocation and social capital. Something that, by the way, procurement is in danger of actually destroying. By actually setting a time limit to a business relationship, you destroy the incentive for the supplier to invest in the relationship. The main reason, I would argue that a good agency adds more value to its clients doing things it hasn't been asked or paid to do than by doing things it has been asked to do. The reason you do those things is it's an investment in the longevity of the relationship. If procurement come in and say every 2.5 years you have to effectively repitch for the business, your past record doesn't count, and we're going to make the decision on price, the incentive to make those discretionary efforts goes away. Or put it very bluntly, there's no point in doing a favor for an amnesiac, okay? Because they'll never pay you back. And so that procurement, which is a behavior very heavily influenced by classical economics, not by actually a knowledge of human relationships or anthropology, often destroys more social capital invisibly than it actually saves money. And then finally, fairness. Now, it isn't just humans who've evolved a great sense of fairness. In economics, by the way, we shouldn't care what the other guy gets. We should simply care about the exchange between what we pay and what we get. What the other guy pays and what the other guy gets should be absolutely irrelevant to us. How likely is it that as a social species we really evolved that way? Well, I think I can prove that it's pretty unlikely with the next film.
So a final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, and with birds, and with chimpanzees. But with Sarah Brosnan, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put 2 capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the 2 monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, it's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests a rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
So these instincts are millions of years old, and there's no way that a bit of economic logic is going to make them go away. I mean, they predate our existence as humans, patently. I think what's interesting is if you look at that scarf model, how well a tech service like Uber delivers on it. There are two levels of certainty. Before you actually book a cab, you're given a reasonable expectation about how long you might have to wait. So you don't have that annoying minicab experience where you ring up not knowing whether they're going to say 1 minute or an hour and a half. It's a pain in the arse because you end up leaving the party too early or too late. There's the map, which reduces the pain of waiting because you can watch the vehicle approach. There's status, because if you think about, I don't know how many people do this, do you time your arrival onto the pavement to coincide exactly with the arrival of the car? Because it makes you feel like Kaiser Soze at the end of The Usual Suspects, you know. It makes you feel like Louis XIV. There's the fact that it doesn't feel like a transaction because you get out of the car with no paper changing hands. There are a whole bunch of things. I would argue that Uber is predominantly an innovation, not an innovation. After all, you've been able to use a telephone to order a taxi in London since about 1904, okay? It's not that that's new, it's the psychology around the experience. And so the most vital thing you can do as a marketer is follow the advice of variously Will Rogers, Mark Twain. This quote's attributed to everybody, to be absolutely honest. If you want to be creative, don't actually create anything first. Seriously, spend a day not creating a thing. Just ask one question. What does everybody assume that we might be wrong about? It's the removal of an assumption which is the greater source of creative ideas than the addition of something. Creativity is, to some extent, a subtractive process. What if this is wrong? And behavioral science gives you a huge license to ask, what if that's not true? You know, everybody in research might say, I don't do this because of X. And behavioral science and advances in psychology give you the license to say, that's why they think they don't do it, but maybe it's not the real reason. And the most interesting thing, in attempts to make economics a science, what they're looking for is physics. They're trying to create a science of human behavior that has rules which are independent of scale and context. So a billiard ball behaves in the same way in Vancouver as it does in Perth, as it does in London. And physics works because the laws are universal. The problem with human behavior is that depending on context, people will either do one thing or they might do completely the opposite. Gift giving. Now, imagine you had a friend at work and just before Christmas you bought them a present. That'd be really nice, wouldn't it? Yeah, generally, I think that'd be nice. If you bought that same friend, particularly if they're of the opposite sex, perhaps, a present every week, that wouldn't be nice, would it? That'd be fucking creepy, right? Okay? If you return a present, as far as an economist's concerned, the recipient has gained something. In fact, it's the biggest insult you can possibly pay someone. So the huge thing about human behavior is it's massively mediated by context and circumstance. And so I'll give you just a few examples to this. Depending on how you think of something, and this is innovation, it can be good or it can be shit. The same thing. You know that business when your plane lands at Gatwick or whatever, and you're expecting an air bridge to walk across into the airport, and then the engines spool down about a mile from the terminal. Everybody on the plane has the same thought. Oh shit, it's going to be a bus, right? And partly because we hate bus replacement services, the bus we just assume is total shite. And then one day, this EasyJet pilot says, I've got some good news, I've got some bad news and some good news. The bad news is we won't be able to get you an air bridge because there's a plane blocking our gate. But the good news is that the bus will take you all the way to passport control so you won't have far to walk with your bags. And I looked at my companion and said, hold on, that's always true, isn't it? They just never told us. I'm actually quite glad there's a bus now because I don't have to walk 2 miles through a bloody shopping centre just to get out of the airport. Next time you're on a plane, try this experiment. When they announce there's a bus, say loudly to your companion, actually, I'm quite glad there's a bus because it saves you having to walk to passport control because it drops you off right outside, okay? And you've just synthesized happiness in everybody within earshot. I mean, when you think about it, the bus thing is just a human instinctive framing of it's the poor man's Abridge. If you're collecting a 7 Series BMW, you'd think that was fantastic, right? And so what the pilot did is, by encouraging you to focus on a different thing, the same thing goes from being rubbish to being brilliant. Probably the most masterly reframing. I'm famous for talking about the Eurostar thing, so I won't do it again. You know, I know. It's a bit like going to see the Eagles and they don't play Hotel California, but I'm not going to do it again. Okay, I'm sick of it. But Cunard is the most fantastic branding. For 30 years, the whole competition in transatlantic oceanic travel was on speed. They were competing for the blue ribbon. Suddenly, jet travel comes along, and they've got a load of ships, which are now totally useless. So they reinvent themselves, essentially, as we're good because we're really slow and civilized. And exactly the same product is just marketed and remarketed in a different way by just pointing out a different attribute. It's the same thing looked at in a different way. London housing is a classic example. Okay, now, in economic theory, if London house prices go up, people who don't want to live in London that much will sell up, move to the seaside, and reduce pressure on London housing. You know, value of asset goes up, people sell, market self-corrects, right? Now, that probably happens in crude oil. People who have a lot of crude oil and don't want so much of it will sell when the price is high. I would argue in London housing, the opposite happens, which is that people are frightened of moving out because A, they fear they might miss out on future gains, and B, they're frightened that they'll never be able to afford to move back in again. Now, how can you claim economics is a science when, depending on the context, human beings will either do one thing or completely the sodding opposite? Yeah, imagine what the world would be like if physical objects had that kind of property. Oh, unfortunately, the billiard balls are in a bad mood, so they're going to behave completely differently today. The attempt to make economics a Newtonian science is one of the worst things ever to happen in business. I'll skip the other two just for reasons of speed. I apologize, but I might share them with you later.
At any one moment, we are being bombarded by sensory information. Our brains do a remarkable job of making sense of it all. It seems easy enough to separate the sounds we hear from the sights we see. But there is one illusion that reveals this isn't always the case.
Ba, ba, ba.
Have a look at this. What do you hear?
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba.
But look what happens when we change the picture.
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba. Ba.
And yet, the sound hasn't changed. In every clip, you are only ever hearing ba with a B.
Ba, ba, ba.
It's an illusion known as the McGurk effect.
Ba.
Take another look.
Ba.
Concentrate first on the right of the screen.
Ba.
Now to the left of the screen.
Ba.
The illusion occurs because what you are seeing clashes with what you are hearing.
In the illusion, what we see overrides what we hear. So,
we don't even perceive the world objectively. Why? Because evolution doesn't give a damn about accuracy, it cares about fitness. And inside our brain is a device that gives us not an accurate depiction of the world, but a decisive depiction of the world on which we can act. So, in that case, you think you can separate what you hear from what you see. In fact, you can't, because your brain's performing what IT people would call error correction. It goes, it's more likely I've misheard than I've misseen, so I'm just going to overwrite that B with an F. And this happens beyond your awareness and beyond your control. This is what's absolutely vital to understand. By the way, wine tastes better if you pour it from a heavier bottle. Analgesics are more effective if you tell people they're expensive. Painkillers are more effective if they're branded. And you'll probably all notice this. Your car drives much better after you've had it cleaned. Have you noticed that? And I had an engineering friend who was driven insane by this. He goes, it must be because the vibration, the polishing tautens the body panels and reduces vibration. No, it's your brain just thinks this is a better car. It's quieter, it accelerates more smoothly, it corners better, you know, because you're more proud of it. And your brain assembles perceptions. Just as when you only see one side of a tree, it basically creates the other side from you. Most of perception is actually information retrieval from past experience. It's not information processing. And our perception is also relative, not absolute. The brain makes the bottom half of that thing look white to compensate for what it assumes to be shadow. If you hold up your hand or your fingers, depending on how close you are, God, I'm getting a bit dangerous there, and you cover the middle, so you can't see the join between the top half and the bottom half of the thing on the left, I mean, the black square has done that for you in a sense on the right, what you'll see is that the top and the bottom are objectively exactly the same color. Your brain's creating the difference. And we have evolved because it's more valuable to detect contrast rather than to detect absolutes. And context determines how we perceive everything. If you just run this very quickly.
Shreddies are supposed to be square.
Have any of these diamond shapes gone out?
New Diamond Shreddies cereal. Same 100% whole grain wheat in a delicious diamond shape.
In research, people actually claimed they tasted different. You presented them as Diamond Shreddies, and they started talking about how they had a slightly different taste and sensation. What we detect is relative, not absolute. That even applies to price. A pound isn't a pound, isn't a pound. Economists assume that the amount of pain you suffer from spending a pound is independent of the conditions under which you spend it. This, of course, is complete and utter rubbish, okay? Something that's expensive in one context can be cheap in another context. By the way, paying contactlessly reduces the perceived cost of things by about 15%, okay? Now, Rolls-Royce and Maserati stopped exhibiting their cars at car shows because a £300,000 car looks really expensive at a car show. They started exhibiting them at yacht shows and aircraft shows. Because if you've been looking at Learjets all afternoon, a £300,000 car is an impulse buy. It's like putting the chocolate next to the till. I'll have a couple of those while I'm here, okay? In the same way, this magnificent thing, if I go on to the next slide, whoop. If you had to buy that in a jar like Nescafe, a jar of Nespresso coffee for an equivalent dosage of caffeine would cost about 40 or 50 quid. And you look at it next to the Nescafe and go, that's totally insane, I can't pay that. But it doesn't come in a jar, and we don't know what an individual Nescafe costs, okay? Because we've never done the maths, have we? We've never worked out how many cups of coffee you get from a jar, unless you're in procurement, obviously, okay? Where you probably put it in little bits of sort of foil wrap with the price marked on each one, right? Like a drug dealer. Now, the thing is about this is that it doesn't come in a jar, it comes in a pod. We don't know what a Nescafe costs, so when we put a 29p pod in our Nespresso machine, I got one myself, I love it like a child, our frame of reference isn't Nescafe, it's Starbucks. And we actually think to ourselves, well, it's 29p, it would cost me £2.20 at Starbucks. This machine's practically making me money. Okay? Now, that also applies, by the way, brilliantly in B2B. I don't know if anybody knows a company called Backhouse Jones, which is a legal firm in the Northwest which specializes in transport law. And they've done the most brilliant innovation. A guy called Ian Jones is both the solicitor and the kind of marketing director of the company. They price it as a subscription. People hate paying for lawyers, but they especially hate paying for them by the hour. You know, you're in a bad situation. Not only are you in this bad situation where you need a lawyer, but the bastard's screwing you for every hour. So they charge a subscription, and the subscription is 26p per vehicle per day. That's how they frame it. And when Ian Jones appears at conferences, at transport conferences, he leaves 29p on every single seat and says, you can have the first day for free. Okay? Now that is a totally brilliant thing. Now economists think that money is money and that it actually is free of any perceptual influence. Nothing could be further from the truth. The other thing you've got to learn is that people don't necessarily do things because they want to do them. They may be doing them because the context teaches them to do them. So be very careful of looking at behavioral data and going, this reveals what people want to do. All right? I'm very, very worried about online choice architecture. I think that, for example, there are totally disastrous facets of online choosing. The fact that when you buy a house, you have to choose flat or house. Why? Okay? You know, maybe you'd rather have a brilliant flat than a shit house. But if you're forced to choose at the very beginning, and the algorithm doesn't show you any random wildcards, you can actually end up narrowing yourself into a corner far too soon. Just in order to make the choice manageable, you actually express preferences you don't really have. Now, this is an extraordinary case of nudging which happens every single day all over the world. Restaurants want to sell you wine. Why? Because you can mark up wine like a bastard, okay? You can't charge 30 quid for a glass of Johnny Walker Red because people know what it costs in the shops. But you buy a case of Chateau d'Obscur 2014 for like €3 a bottle. You basically charge 19 quid for it and everybody goes, marvelous, hint of blackcurrant. I'm a skeptic here. My view is basically that wine loving is basically a way to disguise alcoholism as connoisseurship. I may be wrong, but you've noticed this. You go, you know, it basically makes alcoholism okay. You know, you go out for lunch and have a bottle of wine, it's fine. If you went out and had tequila slammers, you get reported to HR, right? Okay, because it's sophisticated. So the restaurant wants you to drink wine, and what do? They put wine glasses already on the table when you come in. In fact, if you say you're not drinking wine, they take the glasses away in a bit of a huff, don't they? Okay? Secondly, they bring you... No, it's not called the drinks menu, is it? It's not called the drinks list. It's called the wine list. So you've been primed again. And then the choice architecture of the wine list is basically about 4 pages of a ludicrous range of different wines, including rosé, which some people claim is actually a drink, okay? And then there's this crappy back page, like under laminate, for the perverts and deviants who want to drink something that's actually been brewed by a competent scientific process, okay? Rather than having Frenchmen trampling on grapes for half an hour, okay? And then finally, there's the final bit of genius. This is even cleverer still. They only bring 1 wine list. And the guy with the wine list, there's only 1 alcoholic drink you can really share among a table, then automatically turns to the rest of the people he's with and says, red or white? At which point it's game over for the gin drinkers, right? And you would think that everybody wants to drink wine, but is it a product of preference or is it a product of context? And context is so powerful in human decision-making that experimenting with context in every direction you can is about the most valuable thing a marketer can do. Quite often, UX reveals more about the person who designs the UX than it does about the actual customer. I always find it absolutely hysterical that Google, I don't know if you noticed this with Google Maps, because it's designed by Americans, you have a choice. You have car or public transport. And because there's a bunch of septic tanks designing this, they go, geez, this person's looking for public transport, therefore they're obviously an impoverished immigrant who can't afford a car. And they tell you how to make your entire journey by a combination of buses, trams, and tubes. You know, I live in Westerham. You drive to the sodding station, but the algorithm can't get its head around the fact that someone may actually make a journey that involves a car and then public transport. Okay? It's a totally ludicrous bifurcation of choice. It does the railways a massive disservice, by the way, because it takes me about 35 minutes to get into London by train, but it would take me about an hour and a quarter to get to the station by bus. This is one of my favorite innovations recently. I simply said to a pizza delivery firm, nearly everybody orders their pizza in 30 minutes. That means you have to make a separate journey for every single pizza order you receive. Do you think everybody's ordering it in 30 minutes because they want it in 30 minutes, or do you think that's just the established social norm? You look at your mobile app, you look at your website, the default is ASAP. You make a phone call, the assumption is ASAP. I said, why don't you test tweaking the default? Try making the default either 1 hour, 45 minutes, 50 minutes, 40 minutes. They can still choose to have it ASAP, but the default is 45 minutes, or the default is an hour. Secondly, try making it a time of day rather than a duration of wait, to reframe the nature of time. Now, why is this important? It is hugely important because if you have a 30-minute buffer within which you can deliver, you can batch process deliveries. And you can put 3 deliveries to Eastern Sevenoaks on one bike, and you can put 3 deliveries to Western Sevenoaks on another bike. That means you can make 6 deliveries with 2 bikes rather than 6. The big bottleneck in pizza delivery is people order pizzas on Saturday night, which is exactly when young people want to be going to parties, not riding mopeds. And so there's a huge labor shortage on Saturday nights caused by this. They tested it. What happened? You could make the default as long as an hour with no fall off on sales. Secondly, you saved a fortune and benefited the environment by being able to actually make 3 deliveries per trip rather than 1, because you could now consolidate deliveries from a slightly wider time frame. Okay? The third thing, which I didn't even predict, customer satisfaction went up by 50%. I have no fucking idea why. I genuinely don't know. Okay, maybe it was just that actually people liked the fact, they went, actually, I was going to have a shower anyway, and I'd rather the pizza arrived at half time than halfway through the first half. I don't know. I wasn't even predicting that. I was looking at this as an efficiency gain. But don't assume that what people are doing is independent of the way you've presented the choice to them in the first place. One of the most successful things we did in a B2B campaign as Ogilvy's behavioral science practice was we had a software client and people would ring up to cancel their subscription for software. And we tweaked various changes in the call center script, and the most potent one we found was that the first question they asked when someone rang up to cancel was, could you please tell us why you are canceling your subscription to this wonderful software? And they did that because they wanted to gather data that would help them improve the software. The only problem was it was starting a customer rescue call by getting the customer to reiterate a list of negatives about the product. We changed that bit of the call center script to, could you just remind us why you bought this product in the first place? 2 million quid a year in extra subscriptions from one sentence being changed, okay? Now, one thing, by the way, you can achieve butterfly effects like this. Tiny, tiny things can have huge effects. If you want a greater diversity in employment, hire people in groups. Don't hire people one at a time. The human brain does it automatically. When you hire a group of people, you look for complementarity and breadth. When you hire one person at a time, you instinctively look for conformity. A lot of what I think believed to be gender bias, ethnic bias, is nothing other than status quo bias. It's just the fact that when you have one decision to make, you want to make a decision that doesn't look weird. How long have we got? 5? No, 2, okay. If there were a logical answer, we would already have found it, okay? You want to compete with Coke? You produce a drink that tastes nicer than Coke, costs less than Coke, and comes in a really big can, don't you? No one's going to get thrown out of the room for making that suggestion. What's the most successful attempt to compete with Coke in 150 years? It's this. Comes in a tiny can, costs a fortune, it tastes disgusting, okay? We've got to leave more room for testing things that don't make sense. Why doesn't video conferencing take off? Again, I think the reasons are entirely sociological. I think the way to make progress in video conferencing is as much through innovation as innovation. This is one device that interests me, the Meeting Owl. If anybody's a bit of a homeworking nerd, Google Owl Labs and Meeting Owl, because by putting the camera in the middle of the table, it means you can host a video conference without all sitting as if you're on a bus and making the meeting feel weird, okay? And bear in mind, we've been sitting in circular groups for 1 million years, right? Something weird psychologically like that. The other great tip you can do if you video conference, get a separate webcam and put it at 15 degrees to your laptop. Why? Because seeing someone talk at a slightly weird angle isn't off-putting. With the webcam on the top of your laptop, they're nearly making eye contact, but not quite. So, you know, if I spent the whole talk talking to your left shoulder, you'd be pretty weirded out by now, okay? Now, I think they're huge psychological potentials. There is one big distinction. I'll end this very, very quickly. We don't actually optimize. It's not like archery. When the human makes an instinctive decision, we assume imperfect information and a degree of variation. It's more like darts. Don't necessarily aim for the triple 20 because you might get a 1 or a 5. If you're not very good at darts, aim for the southwestern quadrant of the board. You might get triple 19, but if you fail, you might actually get 16 instead. It's actually a better overall outcome. What we're often doing when we make a decision is, as I mentioned with McDonald's, we're trying to reduce variance. Now, once you accept the fact that it's, which it is, by the way, perfectly rational to choose things not only on how good they are on average, but how low the variance is, lots and lots of things become rational that at first glance make no sense. Has anybody here bought their first car from a friend or relative, like an aunt, right? You hated it, right? It was beige, it was automatic, it wasn't the brand of car you wanted. But you were answering a different question, which was, who can I trust to sell me a car? The one thing you knew about the car your aunt sold you, assuming your aunt didn't hate you, was it wasn't going to be totally shite. Because if she knew it was totally shite, she'd be selling it at auction instead. Once you accept the fact that human decision-making is not just about optimization, it's about variance reduction. It's not just about hitting the 10, it's about, or hitting the triple 20, it's about avoiding the 1 and the 5. Lots and lots and lots of pieces of information that marketers can supply, which reduce perceived variance, can be hugely reassuring, even though to a rational economist or procurement person, they appear to make no sense whatsoever. Okay? So I'll end very quickly on this. The one difference, that's by the way why too few people historically always kick the ball straight down the middle. You stand a higher chance of scoring on average if you make a penalty kick straight down the middle. The reason no player wants to do it is you look much stupider if you fail. And the one thing we've got to watch in business, and I'll skip through this very quickly, is there's one big difference with B2B versus consumer marketing. In consumer marketing, people are trying to avoid regret. In B2B marketing, people are trying to avoid blame. What has happened is that people play it safe by making a whole series of small incremental improvements. Like, we've got, a small improvement in our programmatic with a 3% improvement over the past year, because you keep your job that way. The bigger creative gains are slightly riskier, so no one actually takes them. And so we got Kelly the dolphin, was a fantastically clever dolphin. They trained it to retrieve rubbish from the bottom of a pool. Okay? And every time she brought up a bit of rubbish, they gave her some fish. On about the 8th journey, she discovers a massive piece of rubbish. Does she take it to the trainer to get some fish? No. She hides it underneath a rock at the bottom of the pool, bites off 1 piece at a time, and turns it into 10 pieces of fish. And I think that digital marketing has turned to the same thing. It's become digital Taylorism, gradual incremental improvements, but we're spending far too much time as a result looking at the plumbing and far too little time looking for creative possibilities. They are both important and they're often interrelated, but the ratio of time you spend in each has to be proportionate. And at the moment, I would claim it isn't. We're too obsessed with the plumbing. And also, you've got to remember that companies like Google and Facebook, they can't claim a monopoly of good creative ideas, but they can claim a plumbing monopoly. So it's in their interest to pretend that the whole of marketing is about the area where they enjoy real monopoly power. They can't stop you having good ideas. They can't charge for them. Final point. This is a book, sorry, you're going nuts. There's only going to be one sentence. This is a book by an Italian economist who believes something which I've long instinctively believed, never had the balls to say. He believes that the limitation to economic growth for the last 70 or 80 years isn't production or capital or manufacturing or distribution or any of those supply side things. He thinks that what limits economic growth is the human capacity to adopt new forms of consumption. And that there's a speed at which we can actually change our behavior as a society, and it's the speed of adoption of changes in consumption that drives but also inhibits economic growth. Is it true? I don't know if it's true. Bear in mind that 80 years ago, you had to have electricity salesmen to persuade people that installing electricity was a good idea. All right? If he's right, and he might be right, and if he isn't right, he will be right in 50 years' time, the importance of marketing to the economy is much, much greater than even we have dared to believe. Thanks very much indeed.